to ABA Basics for Parents. This presentation is part of the series developed by the team at Pacific Northwest Autism to help provide parents and caregivers with information and a greater understanding of ABA and related topics. All presentations, in part or in whole, are the property of Pacific Northwest Autism. Today we're going to be talking about reinforcement. So what is reinforcement? Reinforcement is one of the most important basic principles of ABA. It shows how we increase the rate of responding for new behaviors. Reinforcement is always associated with increasing behaviors. It is the relationship between an event or behavior and the consequence event that follows it. In order for reinforcement to be meaningful and effective, it must be contingent, which means to be behavior specific. For example, when I first wash my hands after going to the bathroom, then I get a starburst. So it's not just saying something vague like good job, but more like good job sitting, good job washing your hands. That if-then phrase is key. It also must be immediate. Immediate reinforcement is important when you are teaching a new behavior. Immediacy is what builds the contingency between the behavior that you want to increase and the reinforcement. It can be faded out over time. Eventually you can delay reinforcement, but in the beginning it's really important to have reinforcement be immediate. And lastly, individualized. Reinforcement must be motivating for that individual child. Preference assessments are really helpful with identifying what reinforcement is motivating for that individual child and what reinforcement is more reinforcing than other reinforcements. Sometimes kids prefer candy over tokens for some behaviors, and other times they might prefer token over candy, just depending. It is important that the child chooses the reinforcer whenever possible. And in order for it to actually be a reinforcer, it must be motivating enough to increase the behavior, because if the behavior isn't being increased, then it simply isn't a reinforcer. And it's important to remember that not every reinforcer works for every child. There are several different types of reinforcement. There's verbal. An example is good job raising your hand. Tangible, which can be stickers, tokens, money, a toy. Edible, candy, french fries, ice cream. That one's pretty self-explanatory. And social. So those are like high fives, hugs, tickles, squeezes, spins, all of those interactive types of reinforcement. It is important to remember, like I said earlier, that in order for anything to be considered a reinforcer, it must increase the rate of the behavior. So types of reinforcement. There's primary reinforcers, and these reinforcers are unconditioned reinforcers, meaning they're naturally or biologically, they act as a reinforcer, such as food, water, sleep, all those things that we need to survive, so they're naturally motivating for us. Then there's secondary reinforcers, which is what we're typically talking about. And these are the reinforcers that are conditioned reinforcers, meaning they are a previously neutral stimulus, such as points, tokens, stickers, all those things that really have no value until they're paired with another stimulus through stimulus pairing to become motivating. So when that child, through contingencies, learns that these tokens or points earn them a toy or whatever secondary reinforcement they find motivating, then those tokens themselves take on a reinforcing role through pairing over time. Of reinforcement are specific timings of delivered reinforcements. So they are used to increase the percent of occurrence of a target behavior. They are also used to help fade out secondary reinforcement, such as toys and tokens, things like that. Schedules of reinforcement can be broken down into two major categories. There's continuous and intermittent. Continuous schedules of reinforcement are what we're going to be talking about when we're talking about that very immediate and contingent reinforcement that we use when we're teaching new behaviors. So continuous schedules are the delivery of the reinforcer at a 1-to-1 ratio. So every single time that new target behavior occurs that you want to increase, the reinforcer is delivered, and it's delivered immediately after each occurrence of that target behavior. As I mentioned earlier, it's used for teaching new behaviors, and once a behavior is established, then that schedule can eventually be changed to an intermittent schedule. So intermittent schedules is when the reinforcement is not given after every single occurrence of that target behavior. There's a fixed ratio, which means after a set number of responses, the reinforcer will be delivered. So, for example, every third correct response, the client is reinforced. There's variable ratio, which is the preferred schedule of reinforcement because it evokes a higher rate of response because the child cannot predict when the reinforcer is available. An example of that is reinforcing the target behavior after the second correct response, then maybe the fourth correct response, then maybe immediately after the response. You're constantly switching it up so that the child is more likely to respond consistently because they cannot foresee when that reinforcer is coming. It's kind of like the lottery effect or a slot machine effect. Fixed interval means after a set time interval. So it's kind of similar to fixed ratio, but now we're talking about time. So after every 3 minutes, the client receives reinforcement for engaging in that target behavior. And then there's variable intervals, so after varying time intervals. So reinforcing the target behavior after 1 minute, then maybe 5 minutes, then 3 minutes, then maybe 30 seconds, just constantly changing up that interval. So let's talk about negative reinforcement. This is kind of a tricky concept, so bear with me, but it is the removal of an aversive stimulus, so something unpleasant, following a behavior that increases the likelihood of that behavior occurring again. For example, is when you're driving in your car without your seatbelt on, and the newer cars, it beeps at you. And so that beeping is really aversive, it's annoying. And to get it to stop, you're more likely to put your seatbelt on because it removes the beeping noise. So the removal of that beeping noise is going to increase the likelihood of you putting on your seatbelt when driving. Hope that makes sense. Another good example is drying wet hands. So it's uncomfortable to have sopping wet hands after you wash your hands. Well, drying your hands with a towel removes that water, and then you're more comfortable. So you're more likely to use towels to dry your hands because it removes the water on your hands. A good example is if you click on this link or copy and paste this link into your web browser, that YouTube video is a good example of negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is an addition of a stimulus following a behavior that increases the likelihood of that behavior occurring again. So unlike negative reinforcement when it's being removed to increase, positive reinforcement is something is being added to increase the likelihood of that behavior. So this is what you're thinking of when, a kid earns a candy or a toy or something like that. Things are being added to the environment to increase that behavior. So giving your child verbal praise, telling them great job finishing your homework after they complete their homework, that's adding verbal praise, and therefore that would be positive reinforcement. Or giving your child ice cream after they ate their vegetables. So first eat your vegetables, then you get ice cream. A good example of positive reinforcement is listed under that YouTube link below. So prompting, that is what we use to increase the rate of the desired response when we're teaching a new behavior. So it creates a contrived opportunity to evoke the target behavior and reinforce that target behavior to begin creating a contingency between the two. When learning a new behavior, we can't expect a child to only emit the behavior independently in order to earn that reinforcement, or else that contingency is going to take forever to build, and it might not even be built at all between the target behavior and the reinforcer. So prompting is what we use to help teach them, oh, when you do this, you get candy, or you get a high five, whatever they find motivating. There are many different types of prompts. Most intrusive, meaning the hardest to fade out, are physical, meaning hand over hand, fully physically prompting them to do whatever you're asking them to do, or verbally, telling them to say, I need help, telling them exactly what you want them to say to you, or modeling, showing the child the target behavior. So modeling for them what you expect them to do. Gestural, a good example of a gestural prompt is pointing to the desired response. Maybe if you're doing a receptive identifying objects, you would have a card of a dog, an orange, and a spoon, and the target is the dog. You would say point to dog, and then you would gesturally tap at the dog. Positional, putting the target item slightly closer to the child than the rest. So using that same example, you would slightly put the dog card closer to the child and making it more obvious that that's the correct response. And then visual, making the target response bigger, brighter, different color, something that makes the target response very visually different than the distractors. Alright, so let's talk about fading. Fading is a gradual removal of prompts. It is a procedure for transferring stimulus control in which features such as shape, color, and size controlling a behavior are changed to a new stimulus while managing the current behavior. So fading is how we move from a more intrusive prompt such as fully physically hand over hand, helping them achieve the target behavior, to maybe a partial physical where you're just tapping their elbow, to maybe just a gestural where you're just pointing towards the target response, and then eventually all the way down to independent. So it's just a gradual removal of prompts to help them learn this new behavior and contact that reinforcement, but eventually helping them get to being able to emit that target behavior independently. And it also is helped to fade out reinforcement. So fading out that secondary reinforcement, such as, or even candy, it can be completely faded out by reducing or thinning the schedule of reinforcement over time. So those are those intermittent schedules that we talked about. So maybe moving from a continuous schedule where they're getting an M&M for every single time they say hi, and then maybe to a fixed ratio where every third time they say hi to a peer they can have an M&M, and then to a variable ratio where they never really know when the M&M's coming, and then eventually they don't even need an M&M and they'll just say hi independently on their own. That's kind of a very vague general explanation of how you can fade out that secondary reinforcement over time and fading out prompts. In today's presentation, we cited Alberto and Troutman's Applied Behavior Analysis for Teachers, 9th edition, and Cooper, Heron, and Heward Applied Behavior Analysis, 2007 edition. Thank you for tuning in to ABA Basics for Parents. If you have any questions, comments, or topic suggestions, please feel free to email our team at ababasicsforparents@gmail.com.